You're watching KSL, Utah's source for news.
As children, we look up to them as our heroes.
Hi guys, how are you doing?
Thank you for serving us.
You're welcome, buddy.
I've had a lot of people come up to me lately and say thank you for what you do.
But in recent months, reaction to officer-involved shootings locally and on the national front has turned some public reaction against officers, and in some instances, put officers' lives in danger.
That is what a concern to me and for my brother and sister law enforcement officers.
Here at KSL, we have given voice to protesters and critics of police.
What do we want?
Justice!
Now, it's time to scrutinize our own reporting of these emotional events.
If journalists would ask more questions of themselves, news coverage would improve.
And give voice to police.
I mean, no officer goes to work looking forward to getting involved in a shooting.
Who know all too well, no call, no stop is routine.
But we also want to go home to our families.
A split second, a few feet, could stand between life and death every single day. Good evening. It's great to have you along. And tonight we are asking you to help us bridge the divide between police and the public.
For months, we've heard from people critical of officers and the actions they take, but often police haven't been as vocal about their side.
Yeah, tonight you'll see something a little bit different here. We begin with an inside look at the Salt Lake City Police Department. Now, they gave KSL unprecedented behind-the-scenes access for 24 hours. News specialist Andrew Adams getting to see the whole thing and says it was an eye-opener. Andrew, how so?
Well, just how quickly things can change, Mike. Police made me wear this bulletproof vest, and I was actually thankful a couple of times that I had it on. Also adds in some warmth this time of year. But I saw firsthand why Salt Lake City police have to constantly be on their guard.
It's a large amount.
Police work.
Looks like over $20,000 worth of marijuana.
It can be locking down illegal drugs or solving a mystery.
So she shows up at a clinic with a gunshot wound.
And there is no shortage of arrests to be made.
With what you have on you and what you're doing down here, you can't be doing that, all right?
Or people who just need an officer's help. I saw it all.
Ready for whatever.
Over a 24-hour period with the Salt Lake City Police Department. My day begins at 2:30 p.m.
During the attack, the victim was stabbed several times.
as this group of officers starts their shift with a warning at a briefing.
Be aware of those threats that have been made about them.
Word on the street is the drug dealers working around the shelter want to take an officer out.
Don't cancel your backs. Watch your six. Keep your head on swivel.
Having heard that, I'm relieved the call I'm on starts out rather quietly. Public intoxication.
You don't have ID on you?
No.
But as I've discovered, the unexpected is not far behind. A bicyclist collides with our police cruiser.
So yeah, you never know what's going to happen.
We were on our way to a shoplifting call.
Where's your mom and dad at?
A child's been caught stealing.
And if that's not bad enough, she's actually taken the time to remove the theft detection devices on those items as well.
Next stop, jackpot.
Out working the streets? That's pretty rare for us.
Salt Lake cops are assisting Metro Narcotics Task Force. 20 pounds of marijuana jammed into luggage.
Yeah, that's pretty good.
It's one of the biggest busts this officer has seen.
So to see a couple suitcases full like that it's pretty exceptional for us.
22.
Besides the officers, nobody understands the randomness of police work more than dispatchers.
Are you out there with the firefighters?
At one point, one talks a caller through chest compressions.
39, 40, 41.
Another, sending police to an incident or a call for help.
Okay, we're going to get an officer dispatched as soon as possible. Just avoid him.
Dispatchers here handle as many as 600 police and fire calls a day.
Sometimes even that means sending officers to find out that it was just a mistake.
And once the officer arrives, he can find a situation entirely different than how it was dispatched.
And then you go on a call that comes in as a barking dog, and you end up getting into the fight for your life. So you just never know.
Now, on the morning shift with Officer Bill Manzanares.
Our suspect was last seen south along the river.
In less than 2 hours, he's responded to 6 different calls.
You don't want to be paranoid, I guess, is a thing, but you never know when you're going to be dealing with that person that is going to try to kill you or going to try to, willing to do anything and everything that they can to get away.
Officers deal with strangers in unpredictable situations every day and night.
Always different, and that keeps it, in my mind, exciting, keeps me engaged.
But it's also what brings these officers that much closer to potential peril. Every minute they're on the clock.
You're always getting nervous. That's normal. I think that's what makes me realize that I'm still human.
To me, it's all just work.
And it's just one day with Salt Lake City Police. I'm done. But for these officers, it's life, towing the thin blue line, preserving, protecting, surviving, whatever that life puts in their path.
Obviously, certain things I hope I never see in my career, but as far as being afraid of them, I just think I just need to be prepared for them.
Well, the entire time I was with Salt Lake City Police, I didn't see one use of force incident, at least what people would consider that to be. That said, Salt Lake City Police file a lot of use of force reports. Why? Because they take those actions so seriously. Every time they handcuff somebody, they have to fill out the paperwork. Back to you guys.
Yeah, it's like you said in the story there, and like those officers said, you just never know, and they really have to be prepared for anything that's out there. So great story, great insight there. Andrew, thank you. Now, every time an officer responds to a call, a weapon is always at the scene there.
It's the officer's weapon, and at any moment it can be used against them. News specialist Jed Bull found out just how fast that can happen.
I'll approach to this point.
When to shoot. All law enforcement officers are trained to make that life or death decision in a split second.
Remember that an officer makes a decision in milliseconds that's questioned in the court, and the court has the luxury, and so does the jury, of years and time to examine every single movement as it occurred.
Retired FBI agent Juan Becerra demonstrates with me what is known in law enforcement as the 21-foot rule.
I've never heard it preached as a standard principle for assessing threats, but mainly as a rule of thumb. I'm with the FBI. I'd like to where a safe distance for assessing an imminent threat coming towards you. Whoa, 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 whoa! Bang, bang, bang!
That's not much time, is it?
No, not at all. Not at all.
I caught you by surprise. I didn't wait for it.
Completely by surprise.
But that's the way that it happens.
Absolutely.
On the streets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Becerra says in this situation, the officer would have probably needed 40 feet between him and the suspect to have enough time to defend himself with his gun.
Now remember, again, police officers are human, so they're going to have the same physiological reactions that humans, any other human's going to have. The difference is they've been trained to react a certain way over and over and over again in training.
But every situation is unique and poses different threats, as I learned when I checked out Salt Lake County's new Virtra simulator. It's much more realistic than training on just one screen.
On this one, the scenario surrounds you, and you have to keep your head moving. You have to turn around and look to see what could be coming up behind you.
It affects the trainee physiologically.
Oh, it raises my heart rate. It amps the stress up a little bit.
Come away from the baby. Put the gun down now.
If I make good decisions, the threat de-escalates. If I make bad decisions, the threat intensifies.
That's pretty intense. It elevated my pulse rate. I certainly didn't know how to respond to this guy when he had his gun on his wife or his girlfriend. And I think that when it came down to it, he killed her, and he probably killed me too.
But what about those situations that start out relatively calm and then escalate?
If the person continues to escalate, the officer is left with no choice but to use deadly force.
This chart explains the deadly force continuum.
Verbal to physical right here, then rises to less than lethal, and then goes to deadly force. The problem with something like this is that sometimes officers will hesitate in this area.
And that can get an officer killed.
So you can imagine the amount of stress that officers go through on a daily basis.
And you can see how valuable that training is. Jed, great story. Just a few weeks ago, a bank robbery suspect was able to fire an officer's gun during a scuffle. Well, he actually hit himself in the leg. The officer wasn't injured. Coming up in just a few moments here, you're going to hear from a Utah police officer who was shot point blank by a man who got to his gun. More on that in a minute here. Deanie?
It's in the law. Deadly force can be used to prevent death or serious injury to an officer or others. Last year, Utah officers were involved in 14 fatal shootings. Already this year, there have been 3. District attorney's offices have ruled 12 of those were justified. The rest are still being investigated by prosecutors and the FBI. In Utah, it's FBI Special Agent Todd Palmer's job to investigate complaints a police officer violated federal law when they used force.
We'll look to determine, number one, credibility of the complaint. Is there merit here? Is this something that would be a violation of someone's civil liberties? Just because an individual believes that they were mistreated doesn't necessarily mean that it rises to the level of a federal investigation.
Agent Palmer cautions that news headlines and stories aren't always a factual or complete picture of what really happened.
Are the headlines salacious? What is being reported? Is that exactly what happened? Or is that just something to grab people's attention? And the problem with that is people take that as fact. They take that as the way law enforcement does their job.
Palmer examines evidence. For one, he asks, why was the officer on the scene?
You take a good look at that and try to determine, did the law enforcement officer have a legal right to be in contact with that person, whether it's a traffic stop or a pedestrian stop? We'll take a good look at that. And if the law enforcement officer had a legal right to be there, then we have to look at what was the behavior exhibited by the individual upon contact by law enforcement.
How many shots were fired, where the person was hit, how close, how far, those may not determine whether an officer broke federal law. To find out why, we go back to a Supreme Court decision that set case law that affects how an officer's actions can be judged. It was 1989, and the case was Graham versus Connor. Important questions must be asked. Did the suspect pose a safety threat to the officer or the public? And did the officer act reasonably in the moment? Can't use 20/20 hindsight to judge the officer's decision, the Supreme Court ruled.
You have to try and assess that situation as it occurred at that moment for that officer, utilizing the same training and experience that that officer might have had at that time in that scenario.
It's been suggested by some who protested police shootings, officers should back off when a suspect gets wound up. It may sound like a good thought to some, but it turns out that retreating could get an officer charged under federal law.
If the officer were to just walk away, for example, and something horrific were to happen, there is a clause in there where that officer could be held criminally liable for keeping others from harm.
In the 2 years Agent Palmer has investigated officer-involved shootings in Utah, he says not one has violated federal law.
Each of the cases that we've looked at, we've been able to determine that no violation of federal criminal civil rights has been committed.
All right, interesting story there. Now, we want to bring in Debbie Dujanovic into this discussion, and this has to feel a little bit personal, really personal, but for both you and Deanie. You're both married to police officers, and Debbie, you work for the FBI as well.
Yeah, that's right. It is personal to some degree, but we
personal,
both know.
And yet we've both been journalists for a long time. So
long time.
Yeah, we understand the role of balance and context.
And I think we also know that as members of the media, we have an awesome responsibility, and our coverage can frame how the public interprets these events.
Well, it sounded like fireworks.
Pop, pop, pop.
When an officer pulls a trigger, it makes for big headlines, and journalists are challenged by limited information and tight deadlines.
These are some of the toughest stories ever in crime situations because you know they're going to be emotional, and rightfully so.
Media ethicist Bill Silcock came to KSL.
Look at that shot right there.
And he reviewed some of our coverage of the officer-involved shooting of Darian Hunt.
Look at this. This box of photos and memories are all Susan Hunt has of her son Darian, for now.
You're visually already totally into who this victim is.
They wouldn't let me see him.
Soundbite from the mom, powerful. Look how it's 60 minutes framing right there. And if you map out the rest of the story, the amount of time that's given to the police department, minuscule.
His overall assessment?
Those stories did not have the balance that I would have hoped for.
Silcock says a lot of newsrooms struggle to strike the right balance.
Sometimes it's dangerous as a reporter because we get caught up in the empathy.
Especially when police aren't willing to talk or provide much information. And Silcock believes police are getting beat up by the national media.
The audience and some sloppy journalists fill up the silence, and that's where you get in trouble.
But he also says law enforcement agencies can do a better job of getting out their message.
I'm not sure that I'm going to give, if I was giving a report card as a college professor for journalists and failing the public good and serving the police officers, I'm not sure I would give them an F. I don't think I'd give them a C. They wouldn't get an A. But it's pretty tough in the kinds of volatile situations journalists have been trying to cover.
The job of a journalist is to make sure there is balance and that certain voices do not get overused.
So The journalist is the pivot between all of these voices and helping sure each one gets fairly and honestly heard.
Now, Dr. Silcock held several critique sessions for our entire newsroom, and my biggest takeaway is we owe it to you to keep the balance to our stories and keep them in context. Like this, what do you think when you hear the media say, cops shoot an unarmed man? Well, our next story shows just how an unarmed man can become armed and shoot an officer.
April 2005, Orem police officer Phil Murphy is called to a domestic violence situation.
I never would have anticipated those type of circumstances.
The suspect cooperated at first, then Lieutenant Murphy and another officer tried to handcuff him. During the struggle, 21-year-old David Burns managed to fire the other officer's holstered gun, then got a hold of Lieutenant Murphy's gun, shooting Murphy point blank in the back, the bullet narrowly missing his spine.
Puts things in perspective really quick as far as how close things come to changing rapidly for you and your family, and how many decisions you have to make in just split seconds.
10 years later, Murphy remembers the split-second decisions he made that evening, like using pepper spray instead of his gun to try to stop Burns.
Literally filled his face with pepper spray and didn't even faze him.
Burns is still in prison for that shooting. Murphy recently retired after 29.5 years as a police officer.
Lieutenant, as an officer who was shot in the line of duty, what is your perception of what is happening now when it comes to the public outcry about officer-involved shootings?
It's frustrating, and in a lot of incidents lately that people are hearing about in the news and that we're seeing is the suspect or the individual that caused the crime or caused the incident, the officers are reacting to it. If they had simply taken accountability for their actions or respected the commands that they'd been given, they would have their day in court to explain it.
Murphy believes a lot of people are very quick to judge without actually knowing the facts.
And that's easy to do in the confines of your home, easy to do when you're sitting around typing responses on social media about what should or shouldn't have happened.
Murphy said for most of his career, he felt respect from the public.
But I saw a change in a lack of respect for authority, both for law enforcement, but in any sense of authority.
And police officers are increasingly at risk.
More and more, we're seeing more ambush-type situations taking place.
And that's how Utah County Sheriff Sergeant Corey Ride died 1 year ago.
It appears that Sergeant Ride was ambushed. He never got out of the car. He never had the chance to get out of the car.
Neither did those two officers in New York City shot to death 5 days before Christmas. Besides putting their lives on the line, officers also worry about their families.
I've had people kick me, bite me, throw urine on me, threaten to kill me, members of my family.
But without hesitation, he says he would do it all again.
And honor the profession that we took the oath to defend people's rights.
The lieutenant tells me the one thing he was really impressed with is the man who shot him blamed only himself for the shooting. No one else took full responsibility.
Interesting.
All right, thank you, Debbie. We'll continue this conversation and our commitment to balance.
Tomorrow at 6:30, we are going to discuss transparency in officer-involved shootings and also discuss body cams and privacy issues as well.